Right. Good morning, everyone. It's not as great to not to be there in person, but I'm glad at least we could continue talking about Rhizoctonia again this year in 2021. I hope we can meet again in person next year. As most of you know, I'm with the University of Minnesota Extension, and I'm located at the Northwest Research Outreach Center in Crookston. Most of my work is on soil-borne disease of sugar beet, and I do work with a little bit on Cercospora. So today we'll just focus on Rhizoctonia here, and my contact information. If you know, you could just reach out to me anytime for any questions. So number one thing I always emphasize is we just need to know what's killing our beets in the field, right? Sometimes it's very easy, sometimes it's difficult for us too. But unfortunately for the farmer in this particular field, he thought he was dealing with some Rhizoctonia. And then next time around when he grew sugar beets, he planted two different varieties, for his own interest, just to see, how they come up. But what he found out was actually it was not Rhizoctonia, it was actually Fusarium. So now we see the big difference between these two varieties. This is very susceptible to the Fusarium, and the tolerant variety did pretty good. So it's a lesson learned hard way, but that's why we just need to know what's killing those beets. And sometimes it's very plain and simple. Maybe it's just one thing that's causing problem, but other times it's more than one pathogen, right? I mean, it's not uncommon in some of our fields. And this particular field, we were actually looking for just Rhizoctonia pressure, but when we actually planted this trial, like it ended up having both Rhizoctonia and Aphanomyces. Look at the date here, like July 21st, 2015. There are hardly any beets left 2 weeks after this picture was taken. Again, we just need to see what's out there and then what's our biggest challenge in a particular field when we're thinking about management. So again, in 2020, we were fortunate to do this diagnosis to help out the growers to identify. Again, the trend is pretty similar to what we have seen in the past few years. The most number of samples were for Rhizoctonia in 2020. We did see some Aphanomyces, but not as much as Rhizoctonia. As I said earlier, it's very common to have same diseases in the same field, more than one. And the number of Fusarium actually gone down, and we did see some non-disease related issues, but mostly these are either herbicide injury or abiotic stress. But number of samples are more or less similar to 2019, right? So when we think about Rhizoctonia, we have to be careful about two different phases, right? One is the damping off, and the other one is the later in the season for the root rot. When I talk about damping off, sometimes we lose stands right away after planting if the conditions are favorable, but we don't even realize that Rhizoc killed those. That's pre-emergence one. And as the seedlings emerge, if the conditions are favorable, we see necrosis just at the soil line, but then we're going to lose the seedling pretty soon. Not only at this stage, but when the beets are like 2 to 4 leaf stage, if they emerge a little bit later, so look at the strong one and then a little bit weaker one here, they're more susceptible to Rhizoctonia as they keep emerging later into the season. And when we go later into the season, I think the main thing, we need to find a nice warm afternoon and then look at some of the wilting plants. But the most of the story is underground, right? We need to dig up these plants and then see what's actually causing that. And it's also common to see some really dead plants right next to the wilting one. So the infection has started somewhere here. It killed these plants, and then slowly it's moving along this. We can see more pictures in the coming slides. So this is actually a very typical pattern for Rhizoctonia crown and root rot here, right? What we see is chlorosis and then collapse of the crowns, but we can see that they move up and down the row here, right, in the extensive patch. And towards the end of the season, actually what we see is with a bunch of dead plants, more than one typically within a row, and we call these as spiders, right? Basically, these are just dried out petioles, it's lying flat on the ground. The other thing that's most important for Rhizoctonia is actual root rot, right? Because that's the major thing that we're trying to get the sugar out of these roots. But you see these dark lesions developing on the root. Sometimes you see they'll appear like a ladder on this. But the other pattern that we are seeing in the past few years, especially with Roundup Ready sugar beets, because we are not doing much of the cultivation and we are not throwing the soil into the crowns. So essentially, the crown area is pretty clean here, but you see the rot just at the bottom end of the root here, right? And if you look at this, I mean, it's again, the crowns are clean and we see the root rot all the way from here to the end of the root. So it actually gets more challenging in terms of management. So what happens to these roots at the end of the season, right? So pretty soon they're just gonna disintegrate, and basically Rhizoctonia takes a form we call that as a sclerotia. So this is very dormant, and then it can resist some unfavorable conditions in the soil, and it can survive as sclerotia for 2 to 3 years actually. So when we think about the root rot rating, that's some of the data that I will show you later in the slides. So we're using a new scale. It's a 0 to 10 scale. Each point is a 10% increment in the amount of root surface that's infected with rhizoc. So there are two challenges with rhizoctonia, right? Number one, by the end of the season, if you have a lot of root rot, you lost a lot of yield in terms of extractable sucrose. But number two, as Todd said a little bit, that's different in terms of the pile management, but we can't really put these beets in the storage piles because it's gonna make rotting much faster, and you're going to lose more and more in terms of second or third payment that you get. So that's the biggest challenge with rhizoctonia in general. So some key points. When we think about rhizoctonia, it has multiple anastomosis groups, but in sugar beets, we are mostly concerned about AG2-2 and subgroup 3B and 4, and also AG4 predominantly. But I believe right now AG2-2 is our bigger problem. It likes sugar beets, soybean, edible beans, corn, and including all the weeds that we have in the sugar beet fields. Everything is a good host for rhizoctonia. I had told earlier, it can survive for 2 to 3 years as sclerotia in soil. When it comes to distribution of rhizoctonia, it can be very patchy. It's not very common to have a whole field with a uniform rhizoctonia pressure. You see some dead patches of dying beets. Whereas Aphanomyces, it makes these spores that can swim in soil water and then cause new infections. Then we could see extensive damage in the fields. And when it comes to the level of the inoculum depth, it varies from field to field because sometimes it also depends on the type of cultivation practice that you do. But as we saw some roots earlier, sometimes the root rot starts at the middle or at the bottom or at the top. It really depends on where rhizoc is actually in your soil. And the last thing to notice is if you take care of everything to manage this disease, actually by the end of the season, if you have low inoculum, and then it will lead to less buildup. And next time around, when you go into the sugar beets, you can have a pretty good handle on managing this disease. So look at soybeans. The same thing like sugar beets. The seed won't even germinate, or when it germinates, it won't even emerge. And then when you have these young seedlings, you can get this necrosis just below ground, and you're going to lose the stands. And this is a 2018 trial for soybeans inoculated with Rhizoctonia. So these are empty lines here. We lost 95% of the stands to Rhizoctonia AG2-2. The same thing when we repeated in 2019, we only lost about 60 to 70% of the stands, but that's pretty significant, right? Compared to what you see in terms of damage. When it comes to navy beans, again, the same pattern. You see multiple plants dying up and down the row here. Again, if there are any delayed emergence, they're going to be pretty susceptible for Rhizoctonia. Pretty strong plant here. It's a couple of dying here and dying there. Again, very strong early emerged plants. The one that emerged late, it's very susceptible to this. So anything that hurts emergence can be a good factor for Rhizoctonia to cause more damage. So when we think about Rhizoctonia, there's no single tool that really works well for managing this disease. We just need to think about how we can integrate multiple tactics here, right? So early planting is not in our hands, but when the soil is cool, it's really good for sugar beet emergence, and it's not very good for Rhizoctonia. We talked about the crop rotations, but the main thing I want to emphasize today is actually using resistant varieties or at planting fungicides and also the post-emergence fungicides. These are the primary things that we are relying in managing Rhizoctonia in our sugar beets. So first thing I want to talk about is the seed treatment, right? Since 2014, we have a pretty significant development in the sugar beet world for Rhizoctonia. We got multiple seed treatments labeled for managing this Rhizoctonia. Everything belongs to SDHI class. We call this as succinate dehydrogenase inhibitors. So they target a key enzyme that's involved in respiration. So without this, the fungus cannot survive. That's how we control Rhizoctonia with these seed treatments. So, for example, we have Cabina, we have Vibrance, we have Cystiva, we have Metlock Sweet with Cabina, and then Metlock Sweet and Vibrance, right? I also included the years, since we first started using these. So don't worry about some of the information because I'll make these slides available to Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar Co-op so they can share with you. Some slides have a lot of information here. But in the data that I'm going to show, we have all these treatments included in the next slide. So what I have here is the days after planting on the x-axis, and then number of plants per 100 foot of row on the y-axis. This particular trial was done with a 4.4 variety rating for Rhizoctonia. It was done in Crookston, right? So the blue line here is my untreated. So there is nothing on the seed here, right? And the orange one, it's a combination of all the seed treatments, the average that I'm looking at here. So one thing that was noticeable in 2020 in Crookston, we were a little bit dry when we planted, but going into in 2019 fall, we had all that excess moisture. So I think there was good moisture for emergence. But the very first stand count, we did see some reduction in emergence just with the seed treatments compared to nothing on the seed. Again, that carried over to the 2 weeks, but then it got really better. From 2 weeks, as we go into a little bit 5 to 7 weeks, the untreated control, we did lose some stands compared to the seed treatments. They are more or less stable here. The trend actually carried from at least until 7, 8 weeks. And then when we looked at 9 to 13 weeks, we kept losing more and more. But if you look at the number of beets, it's 200 beets per 100 foot of row. That's excellent stands. Overall, the disease pressure was not great in this particular trial. But again, this is something that we don't see every year. Somehow in 2020, it's a little different. But I've shown some data in the previous years, right? We can only rely on seed treatments for 4 to 5 weeks maximum. If the conditions are favorable after that, it's very hard for the seed treatments to do their job. I want to talk about in-furrow applications, right? I think some of you are thinking more and more about in-furrow applications, but most of the data that I show today, it's what we do is we mix the fungicides that we want to apply in 3 gallons of water and mix with 3 gallons of 1034O. And the 6 gallons, actually, it goes down the drip tube directly into the furrow. It's like a drench over the seed, right? It's not a T-band like what they do in Michigan. And the main thing I want you to consider is how different fungicides that you want to use in furrow will mix with the starter fertilizer of your choice, right? I know 1034O is predominantly, it's a major starter fertilizer that most of you use. But again, we mixed 1034O here with different fungicides, and it was not agitated. So it was just sitting there on the desk for 10 minutes. You can see some mix very well, like Asteroid mixes very well, and Quadris starts to separate out. Elatus is a combination of Quadris and another SDHI that's separating out a little bit, and Xanthian, a little bit, the headline component is coming to the top. But again, the key is, they all mix differently, but when it comes to efficacy, they work very good. So you need to have a good agitation system in your tank. You can't let it sit overnight and go to the next morning and then go ahead and do it, right? So that's the key for in-furrow fungicide with the starter, especially if you're using a starter fertilizer. And in the data that I'm going to show, predominantly we use Quadris at 9.5 fluid ounce, Asteroid at 5.7, because this is a concentrated version. You cannot use more than this if you're using in-furrow. Elatus, it's going to get labeled in 2021, so it's coming pretty soon. Like I said, it's a combination of Quadris and the SDHI fungicide at 7.1 fluid ounce. And xanthian, it's a combination of headline and also a biological that's integral. That's a bacillus bacteria. And we have been evaluating Preaxter, Proline, and Propolis as infurofungicides basically in 2019 and 2020. And then I included this particular treatment because I received some questions in the past years to see, can we do a little bit of Quadris in addition to the Cabina? Like Dr. Tom Peters talked yesterday, I call this as a sublethal dose because ideally we want to use 9.5 fluid ounce, but you're only using a little bit less. But we're just going to see how it's working. But this is not really my personal recommendation if you want to do it. I would rather you use 9.5 and then go with the Cabina at 14 grams. So I basically overlaid the data for the infuro treatments here. It's again the average data from all the treatments that we saw earlier. So in general, the emergence actually looked better compared to the seed treatments right out of the box. Again, this is not very common that I see at this site. But again, by 2 weeks, the stands were better compared to the seed treatments. Again, all the way up to 9 weeks, more or less, we got about 10 beats higher compared to the seed treatments. The infuros did pretty good. But once we hit 9 weeks, and when we looked at the stand counts at 13 weeks after planting, basically we lost only about 6% of the stands from here to here for the infurofungicides, and then about 10% for the seed treatments, and again 14% for the untreated control. So here, everything is dropping, but you can see the infuros are they're holding up a little bit better compared to the seed treatments, right? So this is a risk. If you just only rely on the seed treatment, once we go later into the season, we can't expect much work out of them. And in this particular slide, this is the same data from this trial, but this is extractable sucrose per acre, right? And this is what that makes us money. My untreated control here, again, on this axis, I have extractable sucrose per acre and all the treatments that we looked. And basically all my seed treatments are here. And this is my untreated control, right? And most of the seed treatments did more or less similar by the end of the season compared to the untreated control. So by the end of the season, there was not much efficacy from these. When it comes to infurofungicides, the Proline and Preaxter were statistically similar to the seed treatments and untreated control. In terms of infurofungicides in general, and I would say from xanthian to asteroid. So they're all sharing a same letter, including this low rate of Quadris and Cabina 14 grams. It means even though you see some differences here, some lower, some high, but statistically, we need to have a 1,274 pounds of difference to say one is better than the other. But they all did very good, but still some of the top treatments here are Elatus, Asteroid did very good. Again, xanthian, Quadris. I think if you're thinking about infurofungicide, these are some of your primary choices. Even the Proline and Preaxter did pretty good here, but not as great as the others. But again, in terms of the statistical differences, they're very similar. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about another trial where we actually looked at 2 different varieties. And this trial was actually done at 3 different locations. But today I'm going to show data only from the southern Minnesota location here, right? The 2 varieties that we used were 3.7. I'm calling this as a strong variety that's resistant for Rhizoctonia, and the susceptible variety with the rating of 4.4, right? We had 2 different varieties. And then at planting treatments. So we had nothing on the seed or in the furrow. We only had Systiva seed treatment, and now we had Quadris at full rate for in furrow and Systiva at 5 grams. And southern Minnesota, we don't have Quadris in furrow by itself. And when it comes to post-emergence treatment, now when I talk about post-emergence application, it's always as a 7-inch band application. It's not broadcast because that's the best thing that works for Rhizoctonia. So one of the treatment was no post and 4-leaf post. That's Quadris at 14.3 fluid ounce and Quadris at 14.3 at 8-leaf stage, right? So 4-leaf stage application is pretty common for us. That's about June, first week of June. But 8-leaf, I've been doing this trial for almost 4 or 5 years now, both 4 and 8 leaf applications. Now we can look at some of the results for 2020, right? Again, some of the data for this, we created the disease pressure at Renville site by incorporating 50 kilograms per hectare rate for Rhizoctonia. That's multiplied on the barley. It's planted on May 7. The 4-leaf application was done on June 9 and the 8-leaf application on June 22nd. And the trial was harvested September 16, a little bit earlier than what you would do normally. And looking at the weather conditions, the main thing that's important for Rhizoctonia is actually, the soil temperature and also moisture. But once you hit first week of June, the soil is always warm in southern Minnesota, right? It's beyond 65. But two things that stand out here, the rainfall in June and August were actually pretty favorable for Rhizoctonia at this particular site. The overall rainfall actually is much lower. I'm really surprised to see 14 and a half. I always see about 22 to 23 inches of rain at this particular site. So now let's look at some data, right? So we got 3.7 and 4.4 varieties. This is the days after planting on the x-axis and number of plants per 100 foot of row. We did see some benefit using a resistant variety in terms of stand counts, a little bit higher compared to the susceptible variety, but in terms of statistical differences, they were not really significant. So I can't really say one did better compared to the other. When it comes to at planting treatments, right? So we have untreated, nothing on the seed and no in furrow. And they have this red bar, that's Cystio only. And the other one, the light blue one, it's Cystio with quadris in furrow, right? Until 5 weeks, excellent. In general, all the time points from 3 to 7 weeks, both Cystio, and quadris did pretty good compared to the untreated control. It's statistically higher. But once we start seeing, right, there is a trend that we're seeing, relying only on Cystio and Cystio with quadris, a little bit higher, but again, statistically, it's not different. Now, they both did pretty good. And as we go later into the season, right, the harvest parameters, again, 3.7 and 4.4 variety. And here I'm looking at the root rot rating, right? 0 is very clean, 10 is 100%, it's completely dead plant. So we had more disease with the susceptible variety and more number of roots had root rot here. 41% of the roots that we rated had some kind of disease. And then when it comes to percent sucrose and extractable sucrose per ton, it's very high for 3.7 variety. Again, the disease pressure was good at this site as we went into the season. And looking at some of the at planting treatment, right? Nothing on the seed, no in furrow, and then Cystio only, Cystio and quadris in furrow. So now the key thing here is the data is averaged across two varieties, 3.7 and 4.4. None of these are statistically significantly different, right? So we see maybe a slight increase with the Cystio and quadris, about 200 pounds, but it didn't make the cut here. Again, the yield more or less similar. The biggest difference I have seen is for post-emergence treatment at this site, right? We talked about first week of June and then the soil temperatures being warm. And here I have a 4-leaf application, that's done on June 9 and 8-leaf application done on June 22nd here, right? There's a big gap, but somehow my arrow is a little bit funky here. It has to be like right here, and there is a big jump in soil temperature from the first to the second application. Again, the treatments are either 4 or 8. We did not do both 4 and 8-leaf application, all right? Let's look at some of the data here. This is no post, this is 4-leaf, and this is 8-leaf here. Again, it's really less Rhizoctonia root rot, and there are more and more clean roots that with less disease by the end of the season. When it comes to yield, this is averaged across two varieties. We got about 7 tons increase with the post application. When we look at the ESA, we get about 23 to 2,400 pounds increase. This is across both the varieties, right? So that's a pretty good response from the post application itself in 2020. Now, there is a big interaction between the variety and the post interactions. That's why we need to look at this separately. So just with the 3.7 variety, we saw about 1,600 pounds increase in ESA with post-application, whether it's a 4 or 8, whereas it's a 4.4 variety, we saw about 24 to 2,800 pounds. This is a significant increase for both varieties at this particular site in 2020. Again, when the conditions are favorable, I think post-emergence application will do pretty good magic in protecting these beets. And if I look at the yield separately, again, the resistant variety had over 5 tons increase compared to no post, and the susceptible one had about 10 tons compared to the no post. That's again pretty significant. We have seen the higher ESA in the previous slide. So with this, a few things to remember as you think about 2021 Rhizoctonia management. The varietal selection plays a big role, especially if the conditions are favorable in terms of Rhizoctonia management. And the seed treatments, they do work very well, but only for 4 to 5 weeks. You can't rely on the whole season. When it comes to in-furrow fungicides, they can protect from early to mid-season, but expect a little bit of stand injury, but the benefit is much higher compared to the risk if you have severe fields. When it comes to post-emergence application, I would say don't worry about these 4-inch soil temperatures. Just pick a time between 4 and 8 leaf application. Go ahead and get your post-application done. But again, the weather in July and August will drive how the Rhizoctonia will show up by the end of the season. And in general, for susceptible varieties, seed treatment with the post-application is a good practice. But if you think you have some very severe fields for Rhizoctonia, you should do seed treatment, in-furrow, and also post-application. And with that, I would like to thank the R&D board for funding this work and all the collaborators for getting this done. And I would like to thank my team for going above and beyond in 2020 to get the work done. And here is the QR code for your credits for CEUs. We talked a little bit over time, but we'll be happy to take any questions here or via chat.
There's a couple questions, Ashok, in the Q&A box. If you could answer those questions in the Q&A box, that would be great.
Okay, you want me to do live or?
If you could get us back on schedule, if you could type in your answers in the Q&A box, that would be great.
Okay, thank you very much. But please reach out to me for questions either today or anytime.